Do you want a Lazy Susan not only for condiments and dishes at the dinner table, but big enough to put most board games on? This beast has a diameter of 22 inches. To see a list of supplies, tools, materials used, and more detailed directions on this project, check out the description below or go to brattonbuilt.com. I really love how this Lazy Susan turned out, but wow, did this project have a lot of little, what I'll call, hiccups. Hiccup number one, I didn't plug in the mic all the way, so no audio on all the videos I recorded. The wood I used for this Lazy Susan is 1 inch thick and 6 inches wide. It's a piece of alder wood. I chose it because I love the grain and these boards were almost perfect. I'm not using a planer, so I took my time and picked out a piece that was very flat. To get these 4 24-inch boards ready to glue, I started by cleaning up one edge on the table saw. Then flipped the boards over and cleaned up the other edges. Hiccup number 2, trying to cut a circle in 1 inch thick hardwood with a jigsaw. Fail. Maybe it could have been done with a different blade, but I didn't feel safe making this cut, so it was back to the drawing board. Since I didn't feel like my bandsaw was big enough for this circle, I opted to make the cut on a table saw. However, I do think making this cut with a router would have worked great too. To cut a circle on the table saw, I had to make a little jig, which is just a piece of 3/4 inch plywood, and it has a miter slot runner on the bottom. I also had to make some simple stops for the miter slots to keep the jig in position. To make a circle cutting jig, you'll need a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. I'm using a piece that is 22 inches square. You'll also need a miter slot runner. I had this plastic one left over from another project, but you can also use one using hardwood. You'll also need some washers for spacers, a few 3/4 inch screws, some super glue, and a countersink bit. To attach the miter runner, lay out your spacers in the miter slot so the runner sits just higher than your saw's surface. Now squeeze on a wee bit of super glue, place the plywood on top using your fence to make sure it's straight, and so the plywood extends a little bit over your saw blade. Here goes hiccup number 3. I thought the super glue would set in a couple minutes here, but it was about 40 degrees in my garage at this time, and I now know that super glue takes much longer to set up in cold temperatures. On a tip number 2, I let the super glue dry for about an hour. On a tip number 3, I used some super glue accelerator and waited a few hours for it to set. Here I'm positioning the jig on the table saw so it's about center on the table saw, then drawing a line straight across the jig, trying to estimate best where the table saw blade will be cutting. Now I can add a nail at the radius 11 inches down to make that 22 inch diameter circle to act as the pivot point. I don't want to hammer the nail through, so I'm using a little painter's tape. Again, I use painter's tape as a guide for when drilling a hole in the bottom of the glue up. Okay, so this jig, it worked great, but it was frustrating getting the hole to line up with the nail. So now I'm excited to try out this new jig, and along comes another hiccup. Hiccup number 4! The blade stopped spinning mid-cut. I fixed the loose belts, and a half an hour later, the saw was roaring again. I'd let you hear it, but I didn't have the mic plugged in. After cutting out a rough circle, it was time to smooth it out. I thought I could use this featherboard as a stop for this process, but I didn't think it through and it didn't fit. There are magnetic stops you can buy, but I decided to use hardware from this featherboard to make some miter stops. With the stops in place, it just takes a little bit of moving the jig around and playing with the height of the saw blade to get a perfect circle. I love the look of a chamfered edge on my pieces. It's ready to sand it down with 80 grit, 120, and then a 220 grit. Spray on a little water to raise the grain, then another quick 220 grit sand. Then 3 coats of spray lacquer. I originally bought different hardware for this Lazy Susan that didn't spin very well, so I returned it and got this hardware instead, which I'm really happy with. I'll leave a link in the description below. The mat is just a piece of inexpensive rubber shelf lining. The hardware is 12 inches in diameter, so to center it on the bottom of the Lazy Susan, I used a piece of scrap wood and drilled 2 holes 6 inches apart. Then use the hole that was already drilled in the center as a pivot point to draw a circle. Next, put the hardware in place and attached it using 3/4 inch screws. Bada bing! Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.